Hi, everybody. I've talked a lot on my podcast, Origination Point, about rehumanizing ourselves to each other, and I just want to spend a few minutes going a little bit deeper into that. So, this idea of rehumanizing ourselves is to think about what are the connections that we have with each other. And I think that's especially important today because we're being socialized to believe that there's a lot that divides us. And my experience in facilitating conversations around belonging and around feeling that we're included are really rooted around all the connections that we have. And what I want to talk about is the difference between labels and identities. And I know I've talked about this before, and yet I think it's so important for us to keep talking about it and to keep it front of mind. Labels are how we see each other, and that's what creates divisiveness. So if I see you as a label, then I'm going to judge you and interact with you based on my interpretation of your label, which number one may not be how you identify yourself, and number two is for sure rooted in just a story that I'm making up about you because it's rooted in my own assumptions of what that means, which could be so far from the truth about who you are. And we are all labeling each other all the time based on what we see of each other, based on ideology, based on pick any category, pick any identity. And labels are associated with stereotypes. So stereotypes are basically narratives that are socialized in society that for the most part are not rooted in fact and yet widely accepted. And I think they're widely accepted because we don't question them. And I think it's really time to start questioning all the labels that we give each other and to ask ourselves, are you a label or are you an identity? So the difference between a label and an identity is the identity is how I see myself. So my identity is how I identify as a man or as a mestizo or as a father, husband, lover of life, spiritual. Those are all pieces of my identity. Now, the reason why it's important for us to land in our identities is that every one of you who are watching this has an identity. And if we're not sure of who we are, then we leave it to somebody else to create a label and a story about us. And so for me, it's just so important to get grounded in my own identity and understand what that means to me and where they came from. And my identity has grown throughout the years. When I was really young and I didn't understand anything about being self-aware or anything about how to critically reflect on the impacts of my behavior, I was a very disheartening person. And I treated other people poorly. I treated myself poorly. I had all kinds of negative narratives around people. I created all kinds of stories because everything that I did was rooted in labeling. Because I wasn't really aware of my identity. And that might be you. You might be listening to this and wondering, well, who am I? How do I identify? Why are those identities important? When I was younger, my identity was more rooted in how my parents saw me, especially my dad. And the way he saw me was not always bright and cheerful. In fact, a lot of ways that he saw me were kind of hurtful and demeaning and in some ways demoralizing. And so I created this narrative about myself that I was just a victim. And so being a victim meant that I blamed everybody else for what was happening to me. And it also meant that I didn't have to take responsibility for anything because I could be an oh poor me victim. Look at my life and look at the way I've been treated. And so the idea is that we all have labels that are given to us through our own experiences and that other people give to us based on how they see us. I can't control the labels that another person gives me. I can't control the labels that I give myself, because labels, from my perspective, are rooted in false narratives, and they're not true about who I am in my identity. And so even though growing up I was a triggered victim, I was arrogant, I was egotistical, I was mean to people, those were all of the labels that I gave myself. And yet underneath that, my identity was a soft and caring and loving human being that really didn't show up until probably in my late 20s or early 30s. So the identity of who I have always been was clouded under this narrative that I was not enough, that I was a bad person, that I was a mean person. And even though if you met me at that time in my life, you would have experienced all of that, which I would just have to say sorry if you were that person. The reality of who I am underneath all of that is more about what you see today. And I feel like I grew into this, and yet it has always been a part of me. And the reason why I didn't see it was because the people who were closest to me and around me the most were giving me a different narrative, were telling me something about myself that fit their idea of who I was. And sadly, most of those were family. And I think that my parents did the best that they could. They had a certain skill base, and they couldn't do what they didn't have. And so that's another piece of rehumanizing ourselves, is forgiveness. So one step is to claim your identity. So think about who you are in your heart. What are your beliefs? What are your value systems? And if you need to, you can also reflect on what have been the labels that you've given yourself and that other people have given you that have driven how you see yourself, that have driven your choices, and that have driven your interactions. Because we all have both. And so I have false narratives and I have identities about myself. And even today, a false narrative might crop up about who I am. So it's not to say that you ever get to a place where you stop doing those things. I think what we can grow into is that we become more aware of when we are creating a false narrative or living in that, and recognize that we don't have to stay there. That we have the ability to say, I don't want to think this anymore because it's not who I am. And the way you know that it's not who you are is that you feel it, you trust your intuition. And then you have to work. I have to work really hard to not allow those false narratives to come in and guide my life. And so the idea of rehumanizing is connecting through our hearts, is recognizing that everyone you meet, no matter who they are, has a story about what they're sharing and how they're feeling. And if we really want to get past this divisiveness, or this idea that we're better than each other, or we're so different from each other that we'll never find a connection, is to basically rid ourselves of that narrative and realize that there's so much more that connects us than divides us. And I just have to work a little bit harder to find those connections, especially if I see you as the other. So my work and your work and our work in creating a more humane world is to connect from the heart and realize that everyone has a story. Get to those stories, stop labeling each other. And the way we stop labeling each other is we just ask people, tell me what's important to you. So I hope this helps to continue your thinking in how to rehumanize, connect from the heart, and not see each other as the other, but as a part of our own larger community and all the communities that you move in and out of. And remember, keep growing.